They drained 600 acres of swampland in central Florida, expecting to find maybe some trash, a few stranded fish, and the usual mud. Instead, biologists found themselves staring at thousands of writhing bodies, some over 6 feet long, packed so densely you couldn't see the ground. And that was just the beginning. What came next changed how we understand invasive species in America forever. Keep watching, because this story gets absolutely wild. It's 2021, late summer, and the South Florida Water Management District decides it's time to drain a massive retention pond in Palm Beach County. This isn't some random puddle. We're talking about a 600-acre wetland system that had been sitting there for decades, quietly doing its wetland thing. The official reason for draining it: maintenance and inspection of the levee system. Standard procedure. Happens all the time, but here's what nobody expected. As the water levels dropped over the course of several weeks, wildlife started appearing. First, it was the usual suspects. Wading birds like herons and egrets showed up by the hundreds. Free buffet. Fish were getting concentrated in smaller and smaller pools as the water receded, and the birds knew it. That part was normal. Expected even. Then the alligators showed up. Dozens of them. Again, this is Florida. Alligators in wetlands are about as surprising as finding sand at the beach. What was unusual was the number. As the water kept dropping, biologists started counting. 50 gators, 100, 200. These weren't small ones either. Full-grown adults, some of them 10, 12 feet long. But the alligators weren't the story, not even close. As the final pools of water drained away, revealing the muddy bottom of the wetland, that's when biologists saw something that made them call in reinforcements immediately. The mud was moving, not settling, not drying out, writhing. And when they got closer, they realized what they were looking at. Snakes. Thousands of them. Burmese pythons. More pythons in one place than had ever been documented in Florida. Possibly more than had ever been documented anywhere outside of Southeast Asia. They were everywhere, coiled together in massive balls, some containing 30 or 40 individuals, stretched out in the mud, desperately trying to find moisture. Some were dead, already victims of the draining process. Now, before we go further, let's talk about how Burmese pythons ended up in Florida in the first place. Because they're not native. Not even close. Burmese pythons come from Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, southern China. They live in tropical areas with lots of water, dense vegetation, and plenty of prey. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's basically Florida. The story of how they got to Florida is actually kind of mundane. The exotic pet trade. Starting in the 1980s, people in the United States got really into keeping large snakes as pets. Burmese pythons were popular because when they're babies, they're cute. Relatively speaking, small enough to hold pretty patterns, seemed manageable. Pet stores sold thousands of them. Here's the problem. Burmese pythons don't stay small. A baby python is maybe a foot long. An adult female can reach 18 feet and weigh over 200 pounds. That cute pet you bought for your teenager? In 5 years, it's longer than your car and eating rabbits whole. Most people aren't prepared for that. Most people can't handle that. So what did they do? They released them into the Everglades, into the wetlands, into canals and retention ponds. Some escaped during Hurricane Andrew in 1992 when a breeding facility was destroyed. But most of them? People just let them go. Thought they were doing the snake a favor, setting it free. What they actually did was unleash an ecological catastrophe. Burmese pythons are what biologists call apex predators. They've got competition. Tigers, crocodiles, other large predators. But in Florida, they've got no natural enemies. An adult Burmese python in the Everglades is the top of the food chain. Nothing hunts them, nothing controls their population. And they reproduce like crazy. A female Burmese python can lay 50 to 100 eggs at a time. She coils around them to keep them warm. And in about 2 months, you've got 50 to 100 baby pythons ready to start eating everything in sight. Do the math. If even half those babies survive, and half of those are females, and they start breeding in 3 years, you've got exponential growth. The python population in Florida didn't just increase, it exploded. By the time biologists really understood what was happening, it was too late. The pythons had established breeding populations throughout South Florida. Big Cypress National Preserve, the wetlands surrounding Miami, all of it became python habitat. Estimates vary, but most scientists think there are at least 100,000 pythons in Florida. Some think the number is closer to 300,000. Nobody knows for sure because they're incredibly hard to count. And here's why they're such a problem. Pythons eat everything. I mean everything. Raccoons, possums, rabbits, deer, wading birds, even alligators. Studies in the Everglades have shown that mammal populations have crashed by 90 to 99% in areas where pythons are established. Raccoons, which used to be everywhere, nearly gone. Marsh rabbits, can't find them. Possums, vanished. The ecosystem is collapsing. Birds that nest on the ground are disappearing because pythons eat their eggs and chicks. Alligators, which used to be the top predator, now have to compete with pythons. There are documented cases of pythons killing and eating alligators. Not small ones either. 6-foot, 7-foot gators getting taken down by 15-foot pythons. The whole food web is getting rewritten, and nothing about it is good. So when that wetland in Palm Beach County got drained and revealed thousands of pythons in one place, it wasn't just surprising. It was terrifying, because it meant the problem was even worse than anyone had realized. This wasn't the Everglades, the known python hotspot. The pythons were spreading faster than predicted, and they were doing it in huge numbers. The biologists who first arrived on scene couldn't believe what they were seeing. They'd been tracking the python invasion for years. They knew the population was bad, but seeing thousands of them in one place, concentrated like that, it drove home just how completely the pythons had taken over. And these weren't small snakes. The average length of the pythons they found was 8 to 10 feet. Plenty of them were bigger. Several were over 15 feet long. The immediate problem was what to do with them. You can't just leave thousands of pythons sitting in the mud. As soon as rain came, they'd disperse back into the surrounding wetlands. So the biologists called in everyone they could. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission sent teams. The U.S. Geological Survey sent people. Local universities sent grad students. Even the Python Elimination Program, a state-run bounty system that pays hunters to kill pythons, sent their teams. What followed was basically a python roundup. Teams of people wearing thick gloves and protective gear wading through the mud catching pythons by hand. Some of them used snake hooks, long poles with a curved end that let you grab a snake without getting too close. But mostly, they just grabbed them. The process took days, maybe weeks depending on who you ask. The exact timeline is kind of fuzzy because everyone involved was working around the clock. They'd catch pythons, bag them, load them into trucks, and transport them to a facility where they were humanely euthanized. Florida law requires invasive species to be killed, not relocated. You can't just move them somewhere else. There is no somewhere else. They're invasive everywhere in the state. The final count was staggering. Over 5,000 pythons removed from that one wetland, and that's just the ones they found. Biologists estimate that for every python they catch, there are probably 10 more they miss. Pythons are ambush predators. They're masters of camouflage. They can sit motionless for hours, invisible in the vegetation, in the mud, in the water, coiled up under brush. They're almost impossible to spot unless they move. But here's where it gets even more interesting. While the biologists were catching pythons, they started noticing something else. The pythons weren't just randomly distributed. They were clustered in specific areas. And when the biologists looked at what made those areas different, they found something unexpected. The pythons were concentrated around the spots where the water had lasted longest as the wetland drained. Makes sense, right? They need moisture. But it was more specific than that. They were concentrated around areas with dense fish populations. Even as their habitat literally drained away around them, they were still feeding. The biologists started doing necropsies on some of the dead pythons, cutting them open to see what they'd been eating. What they found was disturbing. One 14-foot female had eaten 3 full-grown raccoons and a rabbit, all within the last few weeks based on the state of digestion. Her stomach was so distended she probably couldn't have moved fast enough to escape even if there had been somewhere to go. Another python, a 16-foot male, had eaten a white-tailed deer fawn. The deer was almost completely intact inside the snake. Biologists could still see the spots on its fur through the python's translucent stomach lining. A deer. These snakes were eating deer. That's not normal snake behavior. Or at least it wasn't before Florida became Python Central. That means pregnant. Or more accurately, full of eggs. One female they examined had 73 developing eggs inside her. 73. If she'd been able to lay those eggs, that's 73 more pythons added to the population. Multiply that by the hundreds of adult females they found, and you start to understand the scale of the reproductive problem. The discovery of so many pythons in one place sparked a lot of debate among biologists and wildlife managers. Some saw it as an opportunity. If you can concentrate pythons in one place, maybe you can remove them more efficiently. Drain wetlands systematically. Remove the pythons and repeat. Others pointed out that you can't drain every wetland in Florida. It would be an ecological disaster in its own right. The cure would be worse than the disease. There was also the question of where these pythons came from. Had they always been in that wetland, or had they migrated there as the surrounding habitat got saturated with pythons? The tracking data suggested both. Some of the pythons had been in that wetland system for years, probably breeding there, establishing it as a kind of python stronghold. But others had radio transmitter data showing they'd moved there recently from other areas. This raised an uncomfortable question. If pythons are mobile enough to relocate when their habitat changes, how do you ever control them? You can't fence them in. You can't create barriers they won't cross. They swim, they climb, they move through dense vegetation that humans can barely navigate. Traditional wildlife management techniques don't work on them. The state of Florida has tried everything. They have the Python Elimination Program, where they pay licensed hunters to kill pythons. The bounty is about $50 for the first 4 feet, then $25 for each additional foot. A 10-foot python is worth $200. Sounds good until you realize how hard pythons are to find. Hunters can spend weeks in the Everglades and not see a single snake. They've tried using dogs, python-sniffing dogs, trained to detect the scent of pythons even when the snakes are hidden. It works, kind of. The dogs can find pythons humans would miss. But it's slow, expensive, and requires constant training. You can't train a dog to cover thousands of square miles of wetland. They've tried using radio telemetry. Catch a male python, implant a radio transmitter, release him, and then follow him during breeding season. Males will find females. So theoretically, you follow the male to the female, catch them both. This actually works pretty well. Biologists have removed hundreds of pythons using this method. But it's labor-intensive and expensive. You need teams following snakes through swamps 24/7 during breeding season. There's even been talk of using genetic engineering, create some kind of gene drive that would make python populations crash. Make all the offspring male or make them sterile, or introduce a genetic defect that kills them. The technology exists. The ethical implications are enormous. And the ecological risk of releasing genetically modified pythons into the wild. Nobody wants to be the person who authorized that if it goes wrong. So the pythons keep spreading. They're moving north, expanding their range. They've been found as far north as Georgia. Warmer winters mean more of Florida becomes suitable python habitat. Areas that used to get cold enough to kill pythons occasionally? Not anymore. The freeze line is moving north. And the pythons are following it. The economic impact is huge but hard to quantify. People don't want to go birdwatching when there are no birds. The marsh rabbit population crash has affected everything that eats marsh rabbits. The loss of raccoons and possums has changed seed dispersal patterns. Plants that relied on mammals to spread their seeds aren't reproducing as well. The whole ecosystem is unraveling. And here's the really scary part. Florida isn't the only place with this problem. Burmese pythons have been found in Texas. They've been found in Louisiana. Any state with warm, wet habitat and a pet trade connection is potentially vulnerable. The same thing could happen anywhere. One irresponsible pet owner releases their snake, it finds a mate. And 20 years later you've got an invasion. Other invasive snake species are following the same pattern. Boom destrictors are establishing populations in South Florida. African rock pythons have been found breeding in the wild. Northern African pythons, another huge species, have escaped from captivity and are probably breeding. Florida is becoming a dumping ground for unwanted exotic pets, and they're all thriving. The drained wetland incident in 2021 became a wake-up call. Not that biologists needed it. They'd been sounding the alarm for years. But seeing thousands of pythons in one place, seeing the photographic evidence, seeing video of the mud literally moving with snakes, that got the public's attention in a way that scientific papers never could. The media coverage was intense. National news picked it up. International news picked it up. Suddenly everyone was talking about Florida's python problem. Social media exploded with photos and videos. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some of the comments were predictable. Burn it down. Nuke it from orbit. Typical internet stuff. But some people started asking the right questions. How did this happen? Who's responsible? What's being done about it? The answer to how it happened is clear. Irresponsible pet ownership and inadequate regulations. For years, anyone could buy a Burmese python with no questions asked. No license required. No inspection of your facilities. Just pay the money and take your snake. By the time Florida implemented strict regulations on large constrictor ownership in 2010, it was way too late. The breeding populations were established. The damage was done. Who's responsible is more complicated. The pet stores that sold them? The breeders who produced them? The buyers who released them? The government agencies that didn't see it coming? The answer is probably all of the above. It's a systemic failure spanning decades. Nobody meant for this to happen. But lack of intention doesn't change the outcome. What's being done about it is where things get depressing. Everything that can be done is being done. The state spends millions annually on python control. Thousands of pythons are removed every year, and it's not making a dent. The population is still growing. The range is still expanding. At this point, eradication is probably impossible. The best-case scenario is containment, preventing them from spreading farther north and into new ecosystems. The long-term ecological impact is still unknown. Ecosystems are resilient, but they're not infinitely resilient. At what point does the system collapse completely? At what point do species start going extinct because pythons ate them all? Some biologists think we're already past that point for certain species. The Key Largo woodrat, for example, is critically endangered. Pythons are one of the main threats. When it goes extinct, and it probably will, pythons will be partially to blame. There's also the human safety angle. Burmese pythons rarely attack humans. They're not aggressive, but they're big, they're powerful, and if cornered or threatened, they can be dangerous. There have been a few cases of pythons attacking pets in suburban areas, dogs and cats disappearing from backyards where pythons have moved in. It's only a matter of time before a human gets seriously hurt or killed. The drained wetland has since been refilled. The levee inspection was completed, the maintenance was done, and water was pumped back in. Within months, wildlife started returning. The birds came back first. Then the alligators. And probably the pythons. Any that escaped the roundup, any that were in the surrounding area, they moved back in. The wetland is python habitat again. The only difference is now we know just how many of them are out there. Biologists continue to monitor the site. They've set up camera traps. They're doing regular surveys. They're trying to understand python behavior patterns better so they can develop more effective control methods. But it's hard. Every time they think they understand how pythons move or breed or feed, the pythons do something unexpected. They're adaptive. They're survivors. That's why they're such successful invaders. The story of the drained wetland is a cautionary tale about invasive species, about human short-sightedness, and about the unintended consequences of our actions. Someone bought a cute baby snake 30 years ago. They didn't think about what would happen when it got too big. They released it into the wild thinking it was a kindness. That one snake, or one of its contemporaries, probably contributed to the 5,000 pythons found in that drained wetland. One bad decision multiplied over thousands of pet owners equals an ecological catastrophe. The terrifying part isn't just the snakes. It's what they represent. Proof that humans can fundamentally break an ecosystem through carelessness. Proof that once you introduce an invasive species, you might never get rid of it. Proof that nature, when thrown out of balance, doesn't just bounce back. Sometimes it transforms into something we don't recognize, something we didn't intend, something we can't control. Florida's python invasion is ongoing. It's not a problem that got solved. It's a problem we're learning to live with. Every year, more pythons. Every year, fewer native animals. Every year, a little more evidence that we've permanently altered one of America's most unique ecosystems. What we continue to do, what we might never be able to undo. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe. More content coming soon.